Imagine yourself standing at the threshold of a cabin, snow swallowing the world outside, the storm's voice stretched thin like the cry of wolves across the pines. Then comes the sound, a knock, soft yet deliberate, from the door bolted. From within, "Welcome, traveler, to a night of whispered tales and frozen silence, where endings do not close, but linger." The knock waits, unanswered, and so begins the telling. Now start with first story. The storm had not been forecast, at least not in any way the hunter trusted. Snow often came early in these mountains, but this was something else. It descended without warning, heavy and absolute, swallowing the trails, bending the trees, and silencing the forest as though the land itself had exhaled its last breath. You walked with your rifle slung across your back, boots breaking into drifts that rose to your knees. Hours earlier, you had been tracking deer, their prints sharp in the early powder, but those marks were long since filled. Now there was no sign of life, no sound of movement, only the white abyss pressing closer with every step. By dusk, your legs ached with exhaustion. You thought you saw shapes in the snow branches bending into arms, shadows rising like figures, but they dissolved the moment you blinked. It was then, through the veil of white, that you noticed a dark shape rising out of the storm. A structure, squared, sharp against the blur of trees, a cabin. It sat at the edge of a frozen clearing, its roof heavy with snow, its windows black as sockets. You felt relief surge through you, though it was tempered by caution. You knew the stories, old hunters, stranded trappers, wanderers who stumbled into places that did not belong. But the cold had sunk into your bones like nails, and you had little choice. The door creaked when you pushed it open. Inside was darkness, thick and stale, smelling faintly of mildew and something older wood rotted by years of storms. Yet there was a fireplace, a scatter of kindling, and the bones of a bed frame against the far wall. You stepped inside and closed the door behind you, shaking snow from your coat. The silence was immediate, pressing against your ears until you swore you could hear your own pulse. You built the fire slowly, hands clumsy with numbness, striking the match against stone. The flame caught, licked the logs, and began to climb. You waited for the warmth, for that familiar bloom against your skin, but the heat never came. The flames danced, orange and alive, but you shivered still, your breath clouding in front of your face. It was then you noticed it. A draft, a whisper of air moving across the back of your neck. Not the erratic pull of a storm sneaking through cracks, but something softer, steadier. You turned, but the cabin was empty. The corners loomed dark, shadows that no fire could dissolve. Hours passed like that. The storm outside howled against the walls, the snow slamming against the roof. You tried to sleep, pulling your coat tight around you, but each time your eyes closed, you felt it again, that brush of breath, warm against your cheek as though someone leaned close. You told yourself it was exhaustion, the mind fraying in the silence. At midnight, it came, a knock. Not against the outer door, not from the storm, not from the windows where the snow pressed. No, it came from inside, from the very door you had latched, the one that led nowhere but back to the storm. 3 knocks, deliberate, paused between each, as though whoever, whatever, waited for you to respond. You sat frozen, heart pounding so loud you feared it would answer for you. The fire flickered, shadows stretching like black veins across the wall. You forced yourself to whisper into the silence. "Who's there?" No answer. The knock came again, harder now. The sound of knuckles against wood, shaking the frame. But when you stood, trembling, you saw the door unmoved, the latch still in place, the snow beyond unbroken. The storm grew wilder outside, but within the cabin, a new sound emerged, soft, subtle, the sound of movement. A shifting in the dark corners, boards creaking as if under a second set of feet. You retreated toward the fire, though it gave no warmth. You whispered prayers you had not spoken in years, your words trembling like ash. Still, the noises grew. Something dragged against the floorboards. Something brushed the walls. Then dash silence. It lasted so long you almost believed it was over, until you noticed your breath again. Not your own, but another, slow and steady, breathing in unison with you. You turned toward the bedframe, toward the black gap beneath it. And in the sliver of shadow, you thought you saw it, the pale impression of a hand, curled against the floor, vanishing when you blinked. You could not move. You could not speak. You only sat in that frozen cabin while the storm raged outside. While the fire gave no heat, while the door waited, patient and still. Sometime before dawn, exhaustion dragged your eyes shut. You dreamed of knocking that shook the walls, that echoed through your bones. When you woke, the cabin was silent again, the fire nothing but gray ash. You opened the door slowly, the cold cutting into you like blades. The storm had passed. The clearing stretched silent and untouched, the snow shining beneath the pale light of dawn. You stepped outside. But there were no tracks. Not yours from the night before, not any trace of life at all. The cabin stood alone, its windows staring out, its door creaking softly as if in breath. By midday, the storm had swallowed the clearing again. Travelers would pass through in years to come, swearing they saw a figure in the window, a man waiting by the fire. But when they opened the door, the cabin was always empty. And still, at midnight, the knocking returned, a sound that did not ask to be answered, only to be remembered. The cabin waits still, door rattling at the hour when the storm holds its breath. Yet out there, beyond the woods, another road twists through the snow, where travelers take the wrong turn and find a place that should not exist. A motel without a map, and a door that knocks from within. Now start with second story. The highway was nothing but ice and shadows stretching endlessly through the dark. The storm had thinned into a light snowfall, but the road was treacherous, the kind where headlights carved too small a path, and the blackness beyond felt alive. You and your friend had been driving for hours, the silence in the car, thick except for the hum of the tires. Against frozen pavement, the radio had given up miles back, dissolving into static, and even your phone had lost its signal. Somewhere past midnight, the road marker appeared on the right half, buried in snow. Mile marker 66 in number. You didn't remember passing before, though you'd studied the route. A faded green sign leaned just ahead, pointing toward an exit ramp almost hidden by drifting snow. You should have kept going. You both knew it. Yet the fuel gauge sat low, the cold gnawed through the car, and the thought of shelter. Any shelter was too tempting. The exit curved downward into shadow, leading to a stretch of cracked asphalt lined with pine. The trees pressed close, their branches heavy with snow, as though guarding whatever lay ahead. And then rising from the dark, like a mirage, the glow of a neon sign motel. The word buzzed faintly, each letter flickering as if struggling to stay alive. The building was squat, old, with peeling paint and windows that reflected nothing. A row of doors faced the parking lot, each numbered, but unlit. The office sat at the center, a pale light glowing behind its dusty glass. Inside, the warmth was suffocating, thick with the smell of mildew and something sharper like rust. A man stood behind the counter. At first you thought he was a mannequin. He did not blink, did not move until you both stepped closer. His voice, when it came, was brittle like a tape played too slowly. Room? Your friend nodded quickly. Yeah, one room just for the night. The clerk's hands moved stiffly, sliding a key across the counter. The metal was rusted, pitted, as though it had been underwater. The tag bore the number 6. His fingers trembled, though his face did not. Neither of you spoke as you left the office. Room 6 was halfway down the row. The door opened with a groan, revealing a space that felt more like a stage set than a room. Bed dresser, a lamp with a crooked shade, curtains drawn tight over the window. The air smelled faintly of damp paper. You shut the door, locked it. For a while you tried to laugh it off, a bad motel on a bad night. But the laughter didn't last. The silence in the room was too complete. Even when you whispered to each other, the sound felt muted, swallowed before it could spread. The lamp buzzed faintly, its bulb trembling, and then at 3 a.m. it began. A knock from the inside of the door. You both froze. It was not from the hallway, not from the wind outside. The sound came from within the wood itself, as if something was trapped inside, rapping to be let out. 3 knocks, slow measured. Your friend whispered your name, their voice breaking. You stepped toward the door, your hand hovering over the handle. The wood trembled beneath your fingers. You leaned close and swore you heard it. Breathing shallow, ragged, pressed against the grain. Then another knock, sharper, impatient. The lamp flickered. Shadows shifted against the walls, bending in directions they shouldn't. The mirror above the dresser rippled faintly, as though the glass were not solid, but water waiting to be disturbed. You backed away. Heart thundering, the key to the door sat on the dresser, and you thought of using it, of unlocking whatever waited inside. But the sound grew louder, faster, the knocks turning into pounding that shook the frame. Your friend shouted, and the lamp burst, throwing the room into darkness. The pounding stopped in the silence. The only sound was the two of you breathing. Then faintly from the other side of the room, another knock, this time from the closet door. You ran. The hallway outside was colder than before, lined with doors that all stood slightly ajar. No light came from them, but you felt eyes behind every gap watching as you fled. The office glowed faintly at the far end, but when you reached it, the counter was empty. The clerk was gone. The neon sign flickered outside, struggling to stay lit. You bolted into the snow, your friend close behind, fumbling with the car keys. The engine coughed, shuddered, then roared to life. You sped from the lot, tires spitting ice. The road wound back toward the highway, though you swore it took longer this time. The trees pressing closer, the shadows moving. But eventually the asphalt rose, rejoining the frozen interstate. You looked back once. The motel was gone. The neon glow, the row of doors, the flickering office window, all had vanished into the storm. The only thing behind you was a stretch of empty road, untouched snow, and the faint hollow echo of knocking. You drove until dawn, until the horizon bled pale light. Yet even as the sun rose, the sound followed, in the rattle of the dashboard, in the hollow pulse of the tires. A knock, faint but steady, as though carried within the car itself. Your friend said nothing, neither did you. But both of you heard it, and you both knew that at the next mile marker the knocking would return. The highway stretched on, empty and endless, yet the sound lingered, soft as breath against glass. And in the towns along the frozen valleys, people whispered of another figure who appeared on nights like this, a man with a lantern in the snow, guiding travelers into the dark. Now start with third story. The valley of Black Hollow carried a silence even in summer, a silence that made birds hesitate to sing and wind forget to move. But in winter, when the storms came down from the mountains, that silence grew heavy, suffocating. It was then that the villagers lit their lanterns early and locked their doors, whispering prayers under their breath, for they knew the snow belonged to someone else. The lantern man said he came on the worst nights, when the world outside vanished beneath white, and even your own hands looked strange before your eyes. His light would appear first as a faint glow among the trees, swaying patient, never hurried. A lantern swinging from a man's hand, though none who followed him ever returned to speak of where the light had led. Some believed he was an old guide, a hunter who lost his way and froze, cursed now to walk the storms, forever seeking company for his endless road. Others swore he was older than the town itself, a spirit of the valley drawing souls into the hollow. Whatever he was, the warnings were always the same: if you see the lantern, do not follow. Eliza Moran did not listen. Her cabin stood at the edge of the hollow, half buried in pine, its roof bent under years of storms. She had lived there alone since her husband's passing, though the villagers begged her to move closer into town. She refused, stubborn as the oak beams that held her walls together. But in recent winters, something had changed. Knocking began every night. Just as the storm reached its height, she would hear it. 3 knocks against her door, always 3, always patient. At first she believed it was branches ice breaking or the wind striking wood. but the rhythm was too deliberate. The pause between knocks. Too human. Eliza, meticulous by nature, began to record the knocks in a worn notebook. Each entry bore the date, the hour, and the words 3 knocks midnight. She filled pages with the same description night after night. Sometimes she swore she heard a faint voice between the gusts outside whispering words. Too low to catch the villagers warned her, "It's him, don't open the door." But Eliza, half broken by grief and half compelled by something deeper, found herself listening. Longer each night, leaning against the wood, her ear pressed close, straining for any sign of life on the other side. Was the third winter when the lantern appeared. The storm had been cruel that evening, the kind that rattled shutters and buried paths in minutes. Eliza sat at her table, candle guttering, when she saw it through the frost-coated window, a faint glow among the trees swaying side to side. She rose without thinking, her breath catching in her throat. The light moved closer, not fast but steady, as though whoever carried it knew. She watched. Then came the knocks, 3 slow, deliberate. Her hand hovered over the latch. The fire snapped behind her, casting her shadow long across the wall. She whispered her husband's name into the silence, though she did not know why. No answer came, only the glow of the lantern through the snow, and the promise of something waiting in the storm. She did not open the door that night, not yet, but she wrote in her notebook with shaking hands, "The lantern has come." From then on it returned with the storms. Some nights it lingered far at the tree line, swaying gently like a heartbeat. Other nights it pressed close, the glow spilling across her walls. Always the knocks came, always 3. The villagers grew uneasy. They avoided her cabin, whispering that she had been chosen, that the lantern man had marked her. Some swore they saw her talking to the glow, her lips moving behind the frost-glazed window, answering words no one else could. Here then came the night she followed. It was late January, the snow falling in sheets, the wind tearing at the eaves. Eliza had not slept in days, her notebook filled with frantic handwriting. "He waits for me. The door is not enough. The lantern is brighter." Tonight, that evening, when the knocks came, she rose without hesitation. She pulled her coat tight, laced her boots, and took the notebook in her pocket. The latch lifted with a sound like a sigh. The lantern stood waiting. She stepped into the snow, the storm biting her cheeks raw. The glow swayed ahead, retreating as she approached, never too far, never too near. She followed it through the trees, across the hollow, deeper into the storm. Her footprints filled almost as soon as she made them, erased by the storm's hand. The villagers said they saw the glow that night high on the ridge, moving deeper into the valley. Some claimed they heard faint knocking echoing through the wind, though no one dared go near. By morning, her cabin stood empty. The fire had gone cold, the bed unslept, and the door still ajar. On the table lay her notebook, its final entry scrawled in shaking Hindi. "See him clearly now. He is waiting for me." The cabin was left as it was, abandoned to the storms. The villagers never touched it, never crossed its threshold. Years passed and the wood sagged, the roof caved, but still they swore the lantern moved through the hollow. Brighter, now slower, as if carrying another soul beside it. And when the storms came down from the mountains, when the snow swallowed the roads, travelers still reported the same thing. A glow among the trees, steady and patient, swaying in the dark, always leading deeper into the hollow, always knocking softly as though calling you home. The lantern still swings in Black Hollow, its glow pulsing faintly with each gust of winter wind. And farther on beyond the hollow and the valley, another story waits, of a family gathered on Christmas Eve, when the knocking came not from outside, but from the walls within. Now start with 4th story. The storm began just after dusk, swallowing the forest in white. Wind howled like a chorus of voices, rattling the shutters, while snow pressed heavy against the glass until the outside world dissolved inside. The cabin glowed with the warmth of firelight. Candles lined the mantel, stockings hung in neat rows, and laughter clung to the air like smoke. It was Christmas Eve, and the Harper family had gathered as they always did, tucked away in their cabin deep in the woods. The father, Thomas, had carried the tree inside 2 days earlier, its pine scent filling every corner. The mother, Evelyn, had prepared stew that simmered quietly on the stove. Their children, Anna and Michael, sat cross-legged by the fire. Eyes glimmering with the anticipation only Christmas could summon. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the family was safe. Or so they believed. It began with a sound soft at first, so faint that only Thomas noticed a knock, a tap that seemed to rise not from the door but from the chimney itself. 3 beats playful, then silence. Thomas frowned and glanced upward, but the children laughed. Santa Anna whispered, her eyes wide. Evelyn smiled faintly, though unease flickered across her face. "The wind," she said, returning to the stove. But the sound returned, louder, deliberate, knocking from the chimney. The fire crackled as though answering. Sparks leapt, shadows shifted, and the knocking came again. This time twice, slow, patient. The children clapped. Convinced it was again carolers, they whispered, visitors braving the storm to bring music to their door. But Thomas shook his head. No one in their right mind would walk through snow that deep, not in the black of night. Still he stood, brushing ash from his hands, and crossed to the door. He pressed his ear to the wood. Silence. He unlatched the lock, hesitating, then pulled it open. Only snow. The wind screamed through the crack, biting into the warmth of the room. No footprints marked the drifts. No figure stood waiting, only white stretching, endless and blind. Thomas shut the door quickly, heart heavy with unease. He told the children to return to their games, told Evelyn it was nothing. But in his chest he carried a weight he could not shake later. As the fire burned low, the knock came again, this time from the door itself, twice hollow, rhythmic. Thomas froze, the sound reverberating through the floor. He did not move, did not breathe. Evelyn gripped his arm, her knuckles white. "Don't," she whispered, but the children were already giggling, hurrying toward the sound. Michael tugged the latch. The door groaned open, snow spilled inward, coating the rug, but no one stood outside, no carolers, no neighbors. The drifts were smooth, untouched. The forest beyond stood silent, trees bending under the weight of the storm, and then knocking again from behind them. The children gasped, turning. The sound came not from the chimney nor the door, but from within the walls themselves, a hollow rapping that traveled like footsteps, moving from one corner of the cabin to the next. Evelyn cried out, covering her mouth. Thomas grabbed the poker from the fire, brandishing it, though against what he did not know. The knocking continued, slow, methodical, from inside the walls, above the ceiling, beneath the floor. Always in twos. Knock, knock. The sound seemed playful, almost taunting. Anna whispered, "They're in the walls." Thomas pressed his ear against the wood paneling, his breath shallow. Something moved behind it, not the groan of timber, not the settling of old beams, but something that shifted, dragging, breathing. Fire guttered low, the candles flickered, shadows stretched too long across the floor, and then the voices began, soft at first, as though carried by the wind, a hum, a tune half remembered, caroling, perhaps, though no words could be made out. Only melody, broken and hollow, circling the cabin like a hymn from beneath the earth. Children's faces lit with wonder, but Evelyn began to sob, clutching them close. "Don't listen," she whispered. "Don't answer." But the voices grew louder, the knocking sharper, until the walls themselves seemed to pulse like veins. That night stretched longer than any night before it. They huddled together by the fire, clutching one another, listening, as the cabin filled with the rhythm of knocking, the hollow chorus of unseen voices. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Hours later, when dawn crept pale across the snow, the neighbors from town trudged through the drifts to bring gifts. They found the cabin quiet, the door unlatched, the windows frosted from within. The fire still burned faintly, its embers glowing red. The stockings hung neatly in place. But the house was empty, no trace of the Harpers remained. Only mark left behind was ash spilling from the stockings, filling them heavy as stone. On the table sat a single candle, burned down to wax, and wicked smoke curling upward like the last breath of the house. And in the silence, if one listened long enough, they swore they heard it. Still knock, knock, a patient rhythm, waiting for the next family, the next Christmas Eve. The next door to open. The cabin in the snow remains, its windows hollow, its chimney dark, yet each Christmas Eve the sound returns, to knock steady as breath. And farther beyond, in the quiet hours of night, Another watchman listens, a ranger on duty, in an empty building where the basement door waits to be heard. Now start with fifth story. The forest was always different in winter. It wasn't just the silence, though, that pressed harder than any summer hush. It was the way the cold seemed to make the trees lean closer, as if the woods themselves were listening. The visitor center at Black Pine stood alone, a rectangle of concrete and wood, tucked miles off the main highway. In summer, families came to ask about trails, to buy postcards, to fill their water bottles before hiking the ridge. But in December, when the snows buried the lot and the road froze over, the place became a tomb with lights. That winter, Ranger Eli Mercer volunteered for the night shift. He claimed he liked the quiet, that it gave him time to read, to drink coffee, to watch the snowfall pile higher against the glass. But the truth was simpler. Eli didn't have anywhere else to be. Shift was simple enough. Patrol the grounds, keep the furnace burning, log the hourly radio check-ins with the county station. Every night bled into the next, marked only by the wind clawing at the roof and the faint crack of trees splitting under ice. But one night, just after midnight, something changed. It began with a sounding knock. It came from deep below him, muffled, rising up through the floor like a hand striking wood. Eli froze, coffee mug in hand, and glanced toward the basement stairwell. The door was locked, always locked. He knew because he had tried it himself once weeks earlier. Curious, his supervisor had shaken his head. That floor's been sealed for decades, he'd said. Storage, flood damage years back, nothing down there worth opening. The knock came again, 3 beats this time, hollow. Patient Eli set his mug aside, his pulse thundering. He stood in the empty hall, fluorescent lights buzzing above, and listened. The sound echoed through the ductwork, bouncing against tile. Knock, knock, knock. He forced a laugh, telling himself it was the wind, ice shifting against the foundation. But the sound was too precise, too deliberate. He pulled the keyring from his belt and tried the basement door. As expected, the key didn't fit. The padlock was old, rust chewing its edges. He rattled it once, then stepped back, the sound of his own breath too loud in his ears. For the rest of the night, the knocking came in intervals, sometimes soft, sometimes sharp, always from below. Eli sat at his desk pretending to read, but his eyes drifted again and again to the monitor in the corner, the grainy black and white feed from the security cameras. At 2:37 a.m., he saw it on the camera, labeled Basement Hall. The locked door creaked open. He dropped his pen. The door swung wide into darkness, shadows bleeding outward like water. Then slowly it closed. The feed flickered. When it cleared, the door stood shut again, the padlock still in place. Eli's skin crawled. He leaned closer to the monitor, whispering to himself. No, that's not. The radio crackled. Station check 240. His hand shook as he pressed the receiver. Visitor center, all clear, he said, voice unsteady. The dispatcher replied, copy that. But for a heartbeat longer, the static didn't cut. In it, Eli swore he heard another voice. A whisper threaded between the static, his own name. He slept little that night, and when dawn came, he drove into town to report the incident. His supervisor frowned, rubbed his temples, and told him the cameras were old, prone to glitches. Place has stories, he said, but don't let them eat at you. Just finish your shift. So Eli returned night after night. The pattern repeated. Midnight, the knock. The feed showing the impossible. Sometimes the door opened. Sometimes it shuddered as if struck from within. Once, for a breathless second, he swore he saw something step through. A figure in the grain, standing too, still watching the camera. When he blinked, it was gone. The final night came just after Christmas. The storm was at its worst, snow hammering the roof, the trees bending as though the sky itself were bearing down. At midnight sharp, the knocking began. Eli gripped the radio, ready to call it in, when a new sound joined. Ida. Voice muffled, rising from the basement. Vents a low chant repeating his name. Eli, Eli. He dropped the receiver, stumbling toward the stairwell. The locked door rattled, the padlock shaking against its latch. He should have run. He knew that. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to drive into the storm, to abandon the center and never return. But he stayed. He pressed his Hand against the door, hard hammering breath fogging in the cold air. On the other side, something knocked back 3 beats. Then the padlock snapped open and fell to the floor. The door creaked wide. Cameras caught only fragments, Eli descending the stairs, flashlight beam jittering. The stairwell door swinging shut behind him. The monitor flickering in static bursts as if the feed itself were afraid to look at. 1:12 a.m. The radio buzzed. A voice came through. Station check 115. Silence then. Eli's voice, all clear. But the tone was wrong, too flat, too far away by. Morning. The visitor center stood empty. Eli's truck sat in the lot, half buried in snow. The basement door was locked once again, padlock intact, as though it had never been touched. Eli Mercer was never found. Yet every winter since, on nights when the storm is at its fiercest, the county station logs a transmission. A ranger's voice, calm and steady, calling in from a post that no longer exists. All clear. If you listen closely beneath the static, another sound lingers. Knock. Knock, knock from somewhere far below. The visitor center is abandoned now. Windows boarded, doors chained, yet the radio still carries his voice when the snow comes heavy and far from the woods in a city apartment where no forest should reach. Another knock begins, not from below but from the mirror across the room. Now start with 6th story. The lake was a world of its own, flat, white, endless. A sheet of ice so wide that when the storms rolled in, the horizon vanished and you couldn't tell where the lake ended and the sky began. The fishermen loved it. The lake was tradition passed down through fathers and sons, an unbroken ritual of ice shacks, augers, lanterns, and the slow patience of waiting for the fish to bite. They built their shacks close enough to see each other's lantern glow through the storm, but far enough apart to feel alone. A solitude stitched together with faint points of firelight. That night a storm blew in harder than usual. The wind screamed across the frozen plain, battering the shacks with fists of snow. The men stayed inside, lanterns, swaying radios, hissing auger holes glowing faintly as the ice groaned. And then came the knocking. It started with old Tanner's shack. His lantern glowed weakly through the squall, and from across the ice the others heard it. Knock, 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 steady, deliberate. A sound that didn't belong on a lake of silence. At first they thought Tanner was signaling, maybe calling for help. But when they shouted his name through the storm, there was no reply. The knocks went on, hollow and patient. By midnight, the men gathered their courage. A group of 3 trudged across the ice boots, crunching faces stung raw by snow. When they reached Tanner's shack, the lantern still glowed from within, but the door was bolted. They called again. No answer. The knocking echoed from inside, rattling the wood. One man swung his boot hard against the latch until the lock gave way. The door creaked open. The shack was empty, lantern burning, chair overturned, fishing hole open and steaming faintly in the cold. But no Tanner, and yet the knocking continued, not from the walls, not from the door, but from the ice beneath their boots. Sound rose through the boards, deep and hollow, as if something enormous waited under the frozen skin of the lake. Each thud vibrated in their bones, echoing, too long, too heavy. One of the men dropped to his knees, pressing his ear to the planks. What he heard froze him, breathing slow, heavy, wet. They stumbled out, sealing the shack behind them, but the sound followed them across the ice. The storm carried it, a hollow thud beneath every step. Knock, knock. By morning, the storm had passed. The lake lay silent again, shacks dotting the horizon like black scars against white. The men searched, but Tanner was gone, his shack standing empty, its hole in the ice frozen over, as if it had never been drilled. They tried to forget, tried to pretend it was the storm, the wind, their imaginations. But the next night another shack began to knock. This time it was Silas's. The sound rang across the lake, louder than before, each strike deep enough to shiver the air. The fishermen gathered outside his door, but none dared to open it. They stood in the snow, listening, lanterns casting thin halos of light as the shack shuddered with the force of the knocks. Then, without warning, it went silent. One man swore he saw the ice ripple, just once, as if the lake had taken a breath. At dawn, Silas's shack was gone. Vanished, not collapsed, not broken, not dragged, simply gone. No splintered wood, no hole in the ice, just an unbroken stretch of snow smooth as glass. The men tried to leave that morning, but the storm swallowed the road. They were trapped, their trucks buried, the lake holding them. So they waited, lanterns lit, radios silent, each man locked in his shack with his auger hole freezing shut, praying the knocking would pass him by. But it didn't. In the third night the sound came again. Not one shack, not two, but many. The knocks echoed across the lake, rising from the ice itself, a chorus of hollow fists striking from below. Knock, knock, knock. The men huddled in their shacks, hands over their ears, radios hissing with static. Some swore they saw lanterns moving far out on the ice, drifting where no shack stood. Others said they heard voices whispering through the floorboards, names spoken in a low, watery breath. By dawn another shack had vanished, and then another. The lake never gave them back. When the storm broke days later and the county search team arrived, only half the shacks remained, empty doors swinging in the wind, lanterns burned out. No tracks in the snow, no bodies, no holes in the ice. Just emptiness. The survivors would never speak of it again. Some left the county, abandoning the winter tradition their families had carried for generations. Others stayed, but never returned to the lake, as if afraid their footsteps might wake something slumbering just beneath the surface. And yet each winter, when the storms roll in and the ice thickens, people claim they can still hear it, and knocking, soft at first, then louder. Sometimes beneath their boots, sometimes beneath their houses, sometimes in the walls of their own rooms, far from the frozen lake, as though whatever was beneath the ice has learned to follow. And far from the lake, in a snowless town miles away, a man wakes in the night to hear it again. Not from the floor, but from the back of his closet, where no wind or water should reach. Now start with seventh story. The library basement smelled like dust and damp paper, that faint rot of things forgotten but never fully gone. He wasn't supposed to be there. The archive room was locked most nights, but the student, Henry, had figured out the latch. The film section drew him like a magnet, rows of VHS tapes stacked with faded labels. Relics of projects, lectures, and old local broadcasts, long since obsolete. That was when he saw it, not a title, not a code, just a word scrawled in shaky black marker across the spine. DOR, nothing else. No date, no department, no indication of who had recorded it or why. He slipped it into his backpack in his dorm. His roommate gone for the weekend. Henry found his old player and slid the tape, and static burst across the screen. The hiss of old analog noise, until the image settled. A cabin, small, wooden, standing alone in a storm. The snow swirled in crooked sheets across the lens, streaking the frame with static like streaks of white. The angle was fixed, as if the camera had been placed on a tripod facing the front door. For minutes nothing happened, just the howl of wind and the faint creak of wood straining under the cold. Then came the knock, soft, hollow from inside the cabin. Henry leaned closer, brow furrowing. He replayed it, thinking it might have been in the background, maybe static interference. But no, the sound was real, deliberate. Knock, 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 knock. The camera didn't move. The door didn't open. The storm screamed harder. The wood shuddered, and again. Knock, knock, knock. The sound seemed closer this time, sharper, more insistent. The footage cut. A sudden jump, like something had been spliced. The same door remained, but the lantern glow inside flickered weaker. The snow piled higher against the threshold. Knock, knock, louder now. Henry felt the sound in his chest. His dorm walls seemed to vibrate with it. He paused the tape. Silence filled the room. Too much silence. He pressed play again. The camera wavered, just slightly, as though something unseen had brushed against it. The door rattled in its frame. The knocks came in waves, now longer, harder, each one making the camera shake. Henry leaned so close his breath fogged the screen, and then silence. Storm seemed to mute itself. The world on screen froze. The door stilled slowly, unbearably slow. The latch turned. Henry's pulse quickened. The knob moved. Door creaked inward, not fast, not in a jolt, but steadily, as though whatever had been knocking all this time knew it. No longer had to. The darkness inside the cabin was absolute. No lantern light, no walls, just an abyss blacker than the storm around it. But it wasn't empty. Henry swore he saw it. the dark breathing. The edges of the frame seemed to pulse inward, then outward like lungs drawing in cold air and exhaling something wet and heavy. The final seconds of the tape played out in silence. Just the cabin, the door yawning wide, and the camera tilting slowly toward the void. Then the screen cut to static. The tape word stopped. Henry sat frozen, the click of the player echoing far too loudly in the room. His chest ached as if he'd been holding his breath through the whole thing. And then knock, 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 not from the tape, from his dorm room door. Henry spun, his heart thundered, throat dry. He waited, nothing. The hall was silent. Forced a laugh, but it caught in his throat. He pressed rewind. The tape hissed, clicked, and played again. Same cabin, same storm, same silence. But the door was already open. There had been no knocking this time, no storm leading up to it. Just the door wide, staring, waiting. Henry hit stop, hands trembling. He yanked the tape free and stuffed it back into his backpack. For the rest of the night he didn't sleep. The knocking came again, just once, softer than before, but this time from the closet. By morning, Henry was gone. The dorm manager found the VHS player still humming, the tape inside halfway rewound. The room was locked from the inside, window sealed by frost, bed untouched. No sign of Henry, no sign of struggle, just the tape that was returned to the library without a record, tucked neatly in a drawer that hadn't been opened in years. A week later, another student checked it out, drawn by the single words scrawled across the spine: DOOR.